In 1941, a secret team of pilots known as the Flying Tigers crossed the Pacific Ocean on Dutch vessels posing as farmers, mechanics, and missionaries. Along with them was a shipment of 100 Curtiss-Wright P-40 Warhawks transported discreetly aboard third-country freighters. What few knew at the time was that these were American pilots with American planes on what was supposed to be a very quiet mission with the Republic of China Air Force. Following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, however, everything changed, and the Flying Tigers would become a beacon of hope amid the grim developments in the Pacific. Over 6 months, the 99 American pilots, one had been denied a passport, would reportedly destroy 297 Japanese aircraft with only 14 losses of their own. Claire Lee Chennault. The idea for the mission came from the future commander of the Flying Tigers, Claire Lee Chennault. Claire Lee Chennault was described by pilot Charles Older as, quote, a hard-bitten character who knew what he was there for and how to beat the Japanese. I can't recall anybody I would rather have had as our group leader than Chennault. Chennault spent time as an advisor to General Chiang Kai-shek after being shunned by the War Department for speaking out against the U.S. government in the 1930s. In August 1937, he resigned and started working for the Republic of China's brand new leadership. What would eventually lead to the creation of the Flying Tigers was first an American air unit constructed to fight the Japanese in China before the U.S. even entered the war. Ironically, Kai-shek couldn't speak English, while Chennault couldn't speak Chinese. Nonetheless, the two communicated through an intermediary translator, Sung Mei Ling, also known as Madame Chiang. To the future American pilots, Chiang would come to be known as their, quote, honorary commander. Chennault was recommissioned later on to become lieutenant general before retiring. Because the Flying Tigers technically violated the U.S. Neutrality Act, the project was kept secret. A classified Army intelligence report stated, quote, to avoid a breach of international law, the entire project was organized as a commercial venture. American Volunteer Group. Designated an American Volunteer Group, Chennault's group served Chiang Kai-shek. After the USSR largely withdrew its fighter and bomber squadrons in 1940, Kai-shek desperately wanted American combat aircraft and crews to aid China. When Chennault arrived in Washington, he secured a $100 million loan from Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau. The money was for the Chinese government, a down payment to finance the operation. White House power broker and presidential economic advisor Lachlan Curry dedicated himself to orchestrating the negotiations. Chennault spent the winter of 1940 overseeing the purchase of 100 Curtiss P-40 fighter aircraft. Like many clandestine ops, the group was assembled under a dummy corporation, the Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company. To recruit quote-unquote employees, Chennault and his agents traveled from military base to military base, offering exotic opportunities for adventure. Aside from a $600 monthly paycheck, prospective pilots were offered an additional $500 for every Japanese plane they took down. For comparison, a junior pilot outside of the program only earned about $125 per month for their service. 60 pilots came from the Navy and Marine Corps, while the other 40 began in the Army Air Corps. A single pilot couldn't join the mission after his passport was denied. He had previously worked as a mercenary in Spain. An additional 10 Army flight instructors were hired to supervise Chinese cadets, some of which also served in combat. Before the mission could get underway, the 99 volunteers had to be discharged from the military. The fake private military contractor could also hire Chinese soldiers to train. Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. At first, the Japanese seemed unstoppable. This was especially true for American volunteers equipped with outdated, non-stealth aircraft. They had about the same maneuverability as the Mitsubishi Zero and the Nakajima Oscar, slow and painful. However, the apparent weaknesses soon became strengths. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, developed in the 1930s, was a single-seat ground attack aircraft. Retrofitted with an all-metal design, the previous Curtiss P-36 Hawk assisted in speeding development along. During World War II, it became the third most produced U.S. fighter and remained in operation until the war's conclusion. The aircraft was created as a pursuit fighter. While at low and medium altitudes the plane was exceptionally fast, it tended to underperform at higher elevations. As a tight-turning microplane, it did well in North Africa and Russia. However, it struggled in the Pacific when battling the A6M0 and Nakajima Ki-43. Group Commander Chennault advised his Flying Tigers to not engage in extended dogfighting with the Japanese. These engagements would ultimately disadvantage America, since the P-40 lacked a 2-speed supercharger. This feature was exploited by several Luftwaffe fighters while in high-altitude combat, including the Bf-109 and the FW-190. It was still sent to the operating theaters outside of Western Europe, in North Africa, the Pacific, China, and the Middle East. However, it played a lesser role in Eastern Europe and Italy. The first XP-40 prototype flew its first mission on October 13, 1938. It used an Allison V-17-1019 engine. Its performance, traveling at 315 miles per hour, was somewhat disappointing. After testing, investigators discovered that by moving the coolant radiator to the chin of the aircraft and making improvements to the landing gear, doors, and exhaust manifold, the jet could work. In December 1939, the plane had improved only slightly, now reaching a top speed of 366 miles per hour. The fastest variant would only achieve a top speed of 390 miles per hour. Preparation. Soon after Pearl Harbor, the Flying Tigers deployed to defend Rangoon. Many were housed in a compound left over from British colonialists who'd vacated after the conflict sparked. Pilot John Rossi later recalled, quote, "I was staying at the home of a Scotsman, Bill Tweedy, and when he was evacuated, he left all his clothes. I had quite a wardrobe for a while. We sort of took over the servants and just lived there until we left." Throughout the summer and into the fall of 1942, 300 pilots traveled to Burma. As Camco completed testing of their planes, pilots trained at a British airfield in Taungoo. Chennault trained his men extensively. Several pilots lied about their experience, claiming to have expertise in pursuit flights, when in reality, they'd only ever flown bombers or weaker aircraft. Of the 300 original Camco employees, only 9 came from Chinese cities. Each P-40 mechanic trained at Allison Engine Works. 2 additional Chinese Americans were contracted, a doctor and a Ford mechanic. Of these 11 Chinese Americans, 3 resigned before July 1942. By executive order from Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, the American Volunteer Group started conducting missions in China. Rangoon. The American Volunteer Group never exceeded 62 combat-ready planes or pilots at a time. They were inexperienced. Still more quit soon after arriving in China. Chennault always kept mission first, shuffling unsuited or ill-prepared pilots to staff positions in the rear. The team benefited from the national warning system, which was extensive and accurate. As part of the national network through the country, radios and television stations were set up. Even the tiniest villages and outposts were warned of impending Japanese attacks in real time. Group Commander Chennault had his pilots attack from a higher altitude due to the lesser maneuverability and scarcity of Curtiss P-40 Warhawks. On December 20th, 1941, the 1st Squadron flew to Kunming, defending Burma Road. They downed 4 Japanese bombers on their first encounter. 3 days later, the 3rd Squadron defended Rangoon with 18 planes, holding out until Christmas Day. On the 23rd, multiple Mitsubishi Sally and Ann bombers attacked Rangoon, escorted by Nakajima Ki-27 fighters. Nevertheless, the Flying Tigers intercepted their formation, assisted by the British Royal Air Force's 67th Squadron Brewster F-2A Buffalo planes. 3 P-40s were lost that day. However, the Japanese lost more, 5 out of 15 bombers in fact, and an additional 8 Ki-21s. Notwithstanding, the Japanese successfully bombed both the Rangoon and Mingala-do airfields. Of the lost Warhawk American planes, 2 were expended on the ground, while the other crashed while attempting to land on a bombed runway. On the 25th, the Japanese returned with Ki-21s and Ki-43s. A total of 63 bombers and 25 fighters crossed over Chinese airspace. 14 Flying Tiger pilots flew on their Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, with 15 supporting Buffaloes from the Royal Air Force. Over 2 confrontations, the Allies took down 35 Japanese planes. 5 Warhawks fell. The Mingala-do airfield was bombed yet again, taking out 8 Buffalo planes. The Panda Bears of the Flying Tigers relieved the original 3rd Squadron of carrying out several raids on Japanese airbases in Thailand. The Japanese responded with counter-raids against Mingala-do. The Flying Tigers scaled back their attrition after Japanese forces, heavily outnumbering the Americans, launched their Burma campaign. Still, the Americans defended their position bravely. On January 24th, they shot down 6 Ki-21s. 4 days later, 37 Ki-27s engaged 16 P-40s. 3 Japanese planes dropped, while the American side suffered 2 losses. The next day, 4 additional Ki-27s were taken out. By this time, the Flying Tigers defeated 73 Japanese planes with only 5 losses on their side. However, Rangoon fell to the Japanese. Therefore, the Americans moved to Magwe, an airfield 300 miles north. Over the next few months, the Allies flew 38 planes, of which only 8 were P-40s. For perspective, the Japanese had a staggering 271. The Flying Tigers later relocated to Loy Wing, with only 4 aircraft remaining. Chennault's pilots engaged in morale missions, overflights, and ground attacks to raise the Chinese soldiers' morale. Dangerous and often useless strategically, they revolted. While Chennault suppressed the revolt, the situation deteriorated until they evacuated to Baoshan on April 29th. Despite the repeated bombing, by May the Burma offensive was winding down. Further counterattacks by the Flying Tigers neutralized the Japanese. They stalled at the west bank of the Upper Salween. The Japanese never advanced further. With the campaign almost over, the Flying Tigers switched to providing air protection for China. Chennault's team was gradually replaced by the United States Army Air Force's 23rd Fighter Group. The last flight of the American Volunteer Group took place over Hengyang. It was the same day the group was disbanded. Nevertheless, the pilots took down 4 Ki-27s, losing no planes of their own. Surviving Flying Tiger David Lee Hill, who took down 12 Japanese aircraft, later stated, quote, "We have a record that's second to none. Nobody will ever match that again. 296 to 4. A 50-year secret. It took nearly 50 years for the United States to finally recognize the Flying Tiger's service as an official U.S. military operation. The 99 pilots and additional 200 crew members were awarded the Presidential Unit Citation in 1992 for their, quote, "professionalism, dedication to duty, and extraordinary heroism." The Air Force awarded the pilots the Distinguished Flying Cross in 1996, giving each crew member the Bronze Star. Furthermore, the Republic of China honored Chennault's service. A statue in his likeness was put up in Taipei. It's the only monument to a foreigner in all of Taiwan. The Taiwanese mission hosts a reception to honor the Flying Tigers in Washington, D.C. every year.